The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Susanna Maddox decided that grief was a country she had been living in long enough, and that it was high time she packed what she needed and moved on. She stood at the window of the small boarding house room she rented in Abilene, Kansas, reading the letter for the third time, her fingers pressing flat against the paper, as though she could push the words back into the ink and make them say something different. The letter was from a lawyer named Harlan Briggs, and it informed her, in the clipped and businesslike language that lawyers always used when they were delivering news that would hollow a person out, that her late husband's brother, one Randolph Walker, had died of a fever at his homestead near the town of Dusty Creek, Colorado Territory, in the spring of 1878. Since Randolph Walker had left no will and no known heirs beyond a distant family connection, and since Susanna's late husband Thomas Maddox had once been listed as a secondary contact in Randolph's original land deed filing, the lawyer believed she had a legal claim to whatever personal effects and modest property remained at the homestead. Susanna folded the letter carefully and set it on the windowsill beside a ceramic pitcher that had a small chip on its lip. Thomas had been dead for 2 years. A horse had thrown him outside of Wichita on a wet October morning, and that had been the end of Thomas Maddox, a man who had been neither exceptionally good nor exceptionally bad but who had been hers, and whose absence had left a silence in her life that she had not yet figured out how to fill. She was 26 years old. She had $31 to her name, a trunk of clothes, a good horse named Pearl, and no particular reason to stay in Abilene. She wrote back to Harlan Briggs that week and told him she would come. The journey from Abilene to Dusty Creek took her 11 days on horseback, moving through the wide golden grasslands of Kansas and into the rising country of eastern Colorado, where the land began to wrinkle itself into something more dramatic. The sky out here was enormous. It sat above everything like a cathedral ceiling painted blue, and the clouds moved through it like slow ships on a calm sea. She passed through small settlements and cattle towns, slept twice at proper inns, and the rest of the nights wrapped in her bedroll under the stars with Pearl staked nearby. And she arrived in Dusty Creek on a Thursday afternoon in late May when the cottonwood trees along the creek were releasing their white fluff, and it drifted through the air like the lightest snow she had ever seen. Dusty Creek was not much to look at. It had a main street of hard-packed dirt, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon that doubled as a hotel, a small church painted white that needed repainting, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings arranged without much plan in the surrounding land. But the mountains to the west were extraordinary, their peaks still capped with snow even in May, and the meadows below them were full of wildflowers in yellow and purple, and a vivid burning orange that she had no name for. She thought, pulling Pearl to a stop at the edge of town, that a person could do worse than to end up in a place that was ugly in all the right ways and beautiful in all the ways that mattered. She found the lawyer's office on the second floor of the general store, reached by an outside staircase that creaked alarmingly under her boots. Harlan Briggs was a small, dried-out man of about 60 with a white mustache and intelligent eyes behind wire spectacles, and he received her with a formality that she found both respectful and slightly exhausting. "Mrs. Maddox," he said, rising from his chair, "I am glad you made the journey safely. It is not without its hazards." "I managed," she said, and sat down in the chair across his desk without being invited to, which seemed to surprise him pleasantly. He told her what she needed to know. Randolph Walker's homestead was 7 miles south of town, a 160-acre claim filed under the Homestead Act, with a cabin, a small barn, a kitchen garden, and roughly 30 head of cattle. The cattle were being looked after informally by a neighboring rancher. The property, under the terms of the deed and given the absence of a documented will, could be claimed by Susanna as the nearest available relation through marriage, though there would be paperwork and a brief legal process. She could go out to the property and collect whatever personal effects she wished to take, and she should look through whatever papers she found there, as there might be documents relevant to the estate. "There is one thing I should mention," Harlan Briggs said, tapping his fingers lightly on his desk in a way that told her the one thing he should mention was actually quite significant. "When I rode out to the property to post the notice of Randolph's passing, I found it was not unoccupied." Susanna looked at him steadily. "Who is there?" "A young man," Briggs said. "He gave his name as Clark Walker. He says Randolph was his father." Briggs paused. "Now, I have to tell you that Randolph Walker never, in any legal document I ever handled for him, mentioned a son. He was a bachelor by all accounts in this county. But the young man was very settled in, and he did not appear to be a squatter of the usual kind. He knew details about Randolph that a stranger would not know." Briggs took off his spectacles and cleaned them with a small cloth. "He is, I think, about 24 or 25 years of age. He was polite enough when I came. But he did not leave." Susanna sat with that information for a moment. "What does he want?" "He says the property belongs to him by right of blood," Briggs said. "He has no documentation to prove it, however. No birth record, no letter from Randolph naming him. Without documentation, he cannot file a legal claim, which is why the property, technically, passes to you." Briggs looked at her with the candor of a man who had seen enough human situations to know that the technical answer was rarely the whole answer. "I would recommend speaking to him directly before we proceed with any paperwork." Susanna thought about it on the ride south from town, through meadows that were turning gold in the afternoon light, Pearl stepping carefully over the rocky creek crossings, the mountains growing larger and more specific with every mile. She thought about what it would mean to arrive at a dead man's house and find his son already living there. She thought about what it would mean to be that son, and to have had no warning that a stranger was coming to claim what you believed was yours. She turned up the lane to the Walker homestead as the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the mountain peaks, and the first thing she saw was smoke coming from the chimney of the cabin, which was a sturdy and well-built structure of hewn logs with a proper porch across its front. The kitchen garden she had been told about was visible along the south side of the cabin, and it was not overgrown or neglected. Someone had been tending it. Someone had planted new rows of something that was just beginning to push up through the dark soil in thin green lines. She dismounted and tied Pearl to the hitching post near the porch. She could hear something from inside the cabin. She stood very still on the porch steps and listened, and what she heard was the unmistakable sounds of someone cooking, the creak and hiss of something in a pan, the soft percussion of a spoon against an iron pot, the occasional scrape of a chair across a wooden floor. She climbed the porch steps and knocked on the door. There was a pause, then the door opened. The man who stood in the doorway was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in worn work clothes with his sleeves rolled to the elbows. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His jaw carried 3 or 4 days of stubble. His eyes were the color of the creek she had been following all afternoon, a clear shifting brown that was neither quite brown nor quite green, but something in between that changed depending on the light. He was holding a wooden spoon in his right hand, and he looked at her with an expression that was a mixture of surprise, wariness, and something she could not immediately name. "You are the woman from the lawyer," he said. It was not a question. "My name is Susanna Maddox," she said. "My late husband was Thomas Maddox, who was related to Randolph Walker." "I know who you are," he said, not unkindly, just plainly. "Briggs told me someone would be coming." He stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold. I have got a pot of beef stew on, and there is enough for 2. She stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was simple and clean. A main room with a fireplace, a rough table with 2 chairs, a wood stove in the kitchen corner where an iron pot sat sending up curls of fragrant steam. There were shelves of basic provisions, a few books standing upright against each other near the fireplace, a rifle above the door. On the table there was a single plate and a single cup, already set out, as though he had been planning to eat alone and had simply accepted that she was coming as another fact in a week that had probably contained several difficult facts. "You were cooking for one," she said, looking at the single plate. He glanced at the table and then back at her with an expression that was harder to read than anything she had encountered in a long time. "I have been cooking for one for a while," he said. "Since my father died." He turned back to the stove and began stirring the pot. "Sit down if you want, or look around. That is what you came to do, is it not?" "I came to collect Randolph Walker's personal belongings," she said, "and to understand the situation. I did not come to take anything from you." He turned from the stove then and looked at her properly, really looked at her, and she felt the weight of that look in a way she was not expecting. He was measuring her, but not in the way that men sometimes measured women, which was to assess them and dismiss them. He was measuring her the way a person measured another person when they were trying to determine whether they could trust what they were hearing. "My name is Clark Walker," he said. "Randolph Walker was my father. My mother was a woman named Alara Vasquez who died when I was 9 years old. My father raised me on a ranch in New Mexico Territory until I was 16, and then we had a falling out, the way fathers and sons sometimes do, and I went my own way for several years. I came back because I heard he was sick. I arrived too late." He paused, and there was something in the pause that was enormous and heavy. "I was 3 days too late." Susanna sat down in one of the chairs. "I am sorry," she said. "I am truly sorry." He nodded once, the way men sometimes acknowledged grief when they had been carrying it alone for long enough that they had nearly made peace with it, but not quite. Then he turned back to his pot. "The stew will be done in about 10 minutes, he said. "Will you eat?" She said she would. They ate across from each other at the rough table with the firelight moving on the walls. He had cut a round of bread from a loaf that was on the shelf, and the stew was good, better than she expected, full of root vegetables and seasoned with something she could not quite identify that added a warmth to it beyond just the heat. He ate steadily and not uncomfortably in her presence, which she noticed. A lot of men were uncomfortable eating with a woman they did not know. It made them perform or made them shrink. He did neither. He simply ate. "You cook well," she said. "My father was not much of a cook," he said, "so I learned young." He tore a piece of bread. "My mother taught me some things before she died. After that I just figured the rest out." "What happened between you and your father?" she asked, and then immediately said, "You do not have to answer that." "It is all right," he said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the bread in his hand. "He wanted me to stay and work the land. I wanted to see what else there was. I was 16, and I thought I knew everything there was to know." He almost smiled, but it did not quite make it all the way. "I worked my way up through New Mexico and into Colorado Territory. Worked cattle drives, worked in mines for about 6 months until I decided that dying underground was not for me. Worked as a ranch hand for a man near Pueblo who was a decent enough man. Then I heard Randolph was ill through a letter from one of the old neighbors in New Mexico who somehow knew to find me." He looked up. "So here I am." "Here you are," she agreed. After dinner she asked if she could look through the cabin for any documents or papers belonging to Randolph, and he stood up and showed her to a small wooden box on the shelf above the fireplace. "I already looked through it," he said. "There is not much. His deed papers, a couple of old letters, a photograph." He lifted the box down and set it on the table. "I have no birth record. I know that is the problem. He never gave me one, and my mother died before I thought to ask about it. There probably was one in a church in Albuquerque, but whether it survived or could be found I do not know." Susanna opened the box. The deed was there, and 2 letters written in a hand she did not recognize, and a photograph in a paper folder. She opened the photograph folder. It showed a man of about 40, lean and weathered, standing in front of this same cabin, squinting a little in the sun. Next to him stood a younger man, maybe 18 or 19, the same lean build, the same jawline, the same particular way of holding himself that was simultaneously at rest and ready. "That is the 2 of you," she said. "Yes," Clark said. He looked at the photograph for a moment and then looked away. "He asked a traveling photographer to take it the last time I visited, about 4 years ago. We were not getting on much better than we ever had, but he wanted the photograph." Susanna closed the folder and set it back in the box. She thought about what she was going to do. She thought about Harlan Briggs and his careful legal language. She thought about $31 and a chipped ceramic pitcher and a room in a boarding house in Abilene. She thought about this man standing in this kitchen cooking for nobody at a table set for one in a cabin that had been his father's, and that he was legally about to lose to a woman he had never met. "I would like to stay a few days," she said. "If that is all right with you. I need to understand what is here before I decide anything." He looked at her with that measuring look again. "There is a loft," he said. "It is clean. I can put a bedroll up there for you." "That is fine," she said. "Thank you." Outside, Pearl nickered softly in the small corral where Clark had offered to put her. The mountains held the last copper light of the setting sun, and somewhere down by the creek a bird was singing something liquid and sweet into the gathering dark. The next morning she woke before dawn to the smell of coffee and found Clark already up and moving around the kitchen, and there was something so quietly domestic about it. This tall, dark-haired man who moved with a sure, unhurried efficiency through the morning tasks, that she stood at the top of the loft ladder for a moment before climbing down, watching him without meaning to. He had coffee ready and 2 cups out, which she noticed. "You set 2 cups," she said. "I heard you moving," he said. "Sit down." She sat down and he poured the coffee, and she wrapped her hands around the hot tin cup and looked out the window at the mountain peaks turning pink with the dawn. "What time do you start work?" she asked. "Sunrise," he said. "The cattle need moving to the north pasture. The grass is getting short in the south field." He sat across from her with his own cup. "I have been managing alone since I got here. The neighbor, a man named Aldridge, he checked on the animals in the weeks before I arrived, and I am grateful to him for that. But I have been doing the rest alone." "Can I help?" she asked. He looked at her over his coffee cup. "Can you ride?" 11 days from Abilene," she said. "What do you think?" Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. "I think you probably can," he said. They rode out together that morning in the early cool, the meadow grass wet with dew, the cattle moving ahead of them in a slow bovine stream toward the north pasture gate. Clark rode a big roan horse named George, and the horse clearly knew exactly what it was doing and needed very little direction, which said something about how long Clark had been at this. Susanna kept Pearl on the left flank, and they did not talk much because the cattle required attention, but working beside someone in that way was its own kind of conversation, she thought. You learned something about a person in the way they worked, whether they were patient or impatient, whether they thought ahead or only reacted, whether they were gentle or rough. Clark Walker was patient and thought ahead, and was gentle with the animals in a way that was not soft but was deliberate. And she added those things to the small collection of observations she was building about him the way you would collect interesting stones from a riverbed, not knowing yet what you intended to do with them. By mid-morning the cattle were settled in the north pasture, and they rode back toward the cabin. The sun was full and warm now, the cottonwood fluff drifting. Clark pointed out the fence line that needed mending on the eastern edge, and the section of the creek bank that had eroded in the spring thaw and needed some work before the next rain season, and the barn roof that had a section of missing shingles. He listed these things without complaint, just cataloging them the way a responsible man cataloged the things that needed doing. "Your father let things go a bit toward the end," she said. "He was sick for longer than anyone knew," Clark said. He was looking out at the mountains rather than at her. "I think he did not want to tell anyone because he was afraid of what would happen to the place." A pause. "Afraid it would end up exactly like this, I suppose." Susanna looked at him. The morning light was very good on his face. "It has not ended yet," she said. He turned to look at her, and there was the beginning of something in his expression that was neither the measuring look nor the almost smile, but something newer and less defined. And then George shifted under him, and the moment passed. She spent the afternoon going through the cabin more carefully, not to take things but to understand them. She found the small details of a life, A worn pair of work gloves hanging by the door, a tin of tobacco on the window ledge that was still half full, a Bible with pages marked in pencil, a small carved wooden horse on the mantelpiece that she picked up and turned in her hands. The carving was skilled, the horse caught mid-step, its mane flowing in a perpetual wind. "Did your father carve this?" she asked when Clark came in at late afternoon. He was washing his hands at the basin by the door and he looked over his shoulder. "I did," he said. "When I was about 12, I gave it to him. He dried his hands. He kept it all those years, I guess." She set it down carefully on the mantelpiece. "You should keep it," she said. He looked at it for a moment. "I intend to," he said quietly. That evening he made cornbread and beans with salt pork, and she sat on the porch steps after dinner while the last light left the sky and the stars came out one by one and then all at once, the way they did out here where there was no town light to compete with them. Clark came out and sat on the top porch step, his back against the post, and stretched his long legs out in front of him. He had rolled his sleeves back down against the evening cool. "Mrs. Maddox," he said. "Susanna," she said, "please." He was quiet for a moment. "Susanna." He said her name the way someone said a word in a foreign language when they were deciding whether they liked the sound of it. "What are you going to do about the property?" She had been turning this question over since the moment she arrived. "The honest answer is that I do not know yet," she said. "I did not come here expecting what I found." "What did you expect to find?" "An empty house and a box of papers," she said. "I expected to collect what there was to collect and go back to Abilene and figure out whether I had any legal claim worth pursuing." She paused. "I did not expect to find you here." "I did not expect anyone to come," he said. There was no accusation in it, just honesty. "You knew someone might," she said. "I hoped they would see that I was here and go away," he admitted, and there was a self-awareness in that admission that she respected. That was not a realistic hope. "No," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars. "I do not want to take your father's land, Clark." He did not say anything immediately. She heard him exhale, long and slow. "What do you want?" he asked. It was a very large question, and she was not entirely sure she was ready to answer it. "I want to understand what is right," she said, "and then I want to do it." He turned his head and looked at her in the dark. She could feel him looking at her. "That is a more generous answer than I expected," he said. "I am not an ungenerous person," she said. "I can see that," he said. And then, because the moment seemed to call for something lighter, he said, "You are also a reasonably good cattle hand for someone from Abilene." She laughed, and the laugh surprised her because it was a real one, the kind that came from the chest, and she had not had one of those in a while. He smiled then, a proper smile, and it changed his face entirely, opened it up the way a window opened a dark room to the morning. Over the following 2 days, she found herself less focused on the practical business of the estate and more focused on Clark Walker, which she recognized as a problem of a particular kind that she had not been expecting to encounter on this trip. She watched him work with the single-minded purpose of a man who had decided that the thing he was working on was worth the working. She watched him read in the evenings by firelight, a battered copy of a history of the American frontier that he held with the careful attention of someone who had not had many books and treated each one accordingly. She watched him with the cattle, the patience of it, the knowledge in the way he handled them. She watched him cook, which he did with a quiet concentration that she found unexpectedly charming, the way he tasted things and adjusted, the way he moved around the small kitchen space as though he had mapped it in his mind. She began helping more around the homestead without discussing it, because discussing it seemed to require a kind of formal negotiation that would make it strange when it was not strange. She repaired the kitchen garden fence where a section had pulled loose from its post. She mucked out the barn stalls one morning while Clark was checking the north pasture fence. She found a sack of oats that had been improperly stored and moved them to a dry corner with a board beneath them to keep them off the ground. Small things, but the homestead needed small things done, dozens of them, and she had 2 good hands and nowhere she needed to be. On the third evening, Clark came in from the barn and found the table set for two with a pot of chicken stew she had made from one of the hens that had stopped laying, and he stopped in the doorway and looked at the table, and then at her. "You did not have to do that," he said. "I know," she said, "but I found dried sage in the cabinet and it seemed a shame not to use it." He washed up at the basin and sat down and they ate together, and there was something different about the evening now, something that had shifted in the previous days without either of them saying so out loud. The silence between them was comfortable. The conversation, when it happened, was easy. She told him about Abilene and about Thomas. She told it plainly, without making herself seem either more grieved or more recovered than she was. "He was a decent man," she said. "We were not a great love story. We were two people who made a practical arrangement that turned out to be not unhappy. I was 20 years old when we married. I thought practical and not unhappy was the most reasonable thing a person could hope for." "Do you still think that?" he asked. She looked at him across the table. The firelight was doing something very interesting to his eyes, making them shift between their two colors. "I am less certain than I used to be," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. "Tell me something about yourself," he said. "Something that is not about Thomas or the legal business. Something that is just about you." She thought about it. "I love horses more than I love most people," she said. "I can read almost anything and I prefer a history book to a novel, but I will not turn down either. I grew up in Missouri in a farming family and I spent most of my childhood outdoors and came inside reluctantly, and I have never entirely reversed that tendency." She looked at the table for a moment. "And I think this is the most beautiful country I have ever seen." He nodded slowly. "It is." "How long have you been here alone?" she asked. "In this cabin?" 3 weeks, he said. "Since I arrived and found my father was already buried." He picked up his coffee cup. "The neighbor, Aldridge, he is the one who told me. I rode to the grave. It is up on the hillside above the north pasture under a pine tree." He paused. "I have been here since then, doing the work, not sure what else to do." "What would you have done if I had not come?" she asked. "Stayed," he said immediately. "I would have found a way, hired a lawyer, gone to Albuquerque to look for the church records, something." He looked at her directly. "I was not going to give up this land without a fight." "Would you have fought me?" she asked. "I did not know who was coming," he said. "I was prepared to fight whoever came." He said it without apology. "But you are harder to fight than I expected." "Why?" "Because you are reasonable," he said. "And because you set my father's kitchen garden fence back in place, and you have not once made me feel like a trespasser in my own home." He stopped himself, as though he had said more than he intended. "It is your home," she said quietly. "Whatever the legal documents say right now, this is your home. I can see that." The gratitude in his expression was almost more than she could look at directly. It was the kind of gratitude that came from a person who had been braced for a blow and found instead something gentle. The fourth day brought a problem. She had ridden out to the south fence line to look at the section Clark had pointed out as needing repair, and she was examining the posts when she heard hoofbeats, and a man rode up on a big black horse. He was heavyset, somewhere in his 40s, with a thick reddish beard and the look of a man who was accustomed to being the largest person in any given situation. "You the woman from town," he said, pulling up without any greeting. "My name is Susanna Maddox," she said. "Calvin Aldridge," he said. "I ranch the property east of here." He looked around the fence line, then back at her. "Heard from Briggs that you came to claim the Walker place." "I came to sort out the situation," she said. "I have not made any decisions yet." Aldridge studied her with small, sharp eyes. "That boy in there has no legal claim," he said. "I knew Randolph for 15 years. He never mentioned a son to me. Not once." "He mentioned him in other ways," she said. "There is a photograph inside that cabin and a carved wooden horse on the mantelpiece. The boy made it for his father when he was 12 years old." Aldridge shifted in his saddle. "That is sentiment, not law." "What is your interest in this, Mr. Aldridge?" she asked. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that wanted to appear friendly and did not quite succeed. "I have been looking to expand my grazing land northward. The Walker place has the best creek access in the valley. If the estate goes through proper legal channels and you decide you do not want to hold on to 160 acres out here, I would be prepared to make a fair offer." "I see," she said. "I am just saying you have options," he said. "That is all." He tipped his hat and turned his horse and rode away. She sat on Pearl for a moment after he left, watching him go. The mountains above her were very still and very large. When she got back to the cabin, Clark was replacing shingles on the barn roof, balanced on the peak with an ease that suggested he had spent considerable time on high places. She called up to him, "Calvin Aldridge came to see me." He climbed down the ladder and stood below her, shading his eyes. "What did he want?" "To let me know the property could be sold to him if I decided not to keep it," she said. Something went still in Clark's face. "He has been circling this place since before my father died," he said. "Randolph told me in the letter he sent before I could get here, said Aldridge was after the creek access." "I thought it might be something like that," she said. Clark looked at her steadily. "What are you going to do?" She had been turning this over in her mind all the way back from the fence line. The mountains and the meadows and the creek and the rising smell of the sage in the afternoon heat, all contributing to a clarity that was surprising in its speed. She was a practical woman. She had always been a practical woman. But there was something about this place, and something about this man standing below her in the afternoon sun with sawdust on his sleeve and worry in his eyes, that was pulling at something inside her that was less practical and more essential. "I'm going to help you keep it," she said. He stared at her. "I have a legal claim that you currently lack documentation for," she said, thinking it through out loud as she went. "But you have blood right and 15 years of knowledge about this land through your father. There has to be a way to combine those two things into something that cannot be taken from you." She paused. "I want to go back to town and talk to Briggs again." Clark was quiet for a long moment. "Why would you do that?" he finally said. "You could sell to Aldridge and go back to Abilene with enough money to set yourself up properly." "I could," she said, "but I do not want to." He was looking at her with an expression she could not entirely decipher. "Susanna," he said, and the way he said her name had changed slightly from the first time, had become something more careful and more deliberate. "You have been here 4 days." "I know," she said. "You do not owe me anything." "I know that too," she said. She looked at him from the back of her horse, the sun very bright between them. "But I am going to help you anyway, if you will let me." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded slowly, and something in the set of his shoulders changed, some tension releasing. "All right," he said. "Thank you." "Do not thank me yet," she said. "I have not actually done anything." She rode back to town the following morning and spent 2 hours with Harlan Briggs going through every legal option available. Briggs was more engaged now than he had been initially. She thought partly because the situation interested him professionally, and partly because she presented the case with a directness and thoroughness that he seemed to respect. They went through the Homestead Act provisions, the territorial inheritance laws, and the question of what documentation might be available. Briggs thought that if Clark could produce any communication from Randolph Walker that acknowledged him as his son, letters, anything in writing, that would considerably strengthen a claim to have the estate held in his name pending further investigation. When she got back to the cabin that afternoon and told Clark what she had learned, he went to the wooden box above the fireplace and took out the 2 old letters. He had looked at them before, he said, but only briefly. He spread them on the table and they read them together, and in the second letter, written in Randolph Walker's rough, unpracticed hand, there was a single line that said, "I know you are angry with me, and I suppose you have a right to be, but you are my boy and this place will be yours when I am gone." Susanna read the sentence twice and then looked at Clark. He was staring at it with an expression she could not look at for very long because it contained too much at once. "That is what we need," she said. "This letter and the photograph and your testimony. Briggs thinks it is enough to file a counterclaim and put the estate in contest, which means it cannot be transferred to anyone while the contest is open." She paused. "And then we find those church records in Albuquerque." It could take a long time, he said. Yes, she said. Legal things tend to. He looked up from the letter. And in the meantime, she thought about her room in Abilene with the chipped pitcher. She thought about $31. She thought about 11 days on horseback through the most beautiful country she had ever seen, arriving here at a cabin with smoke from the chimney and a man cooking for nobody. In the meantime, I thought I might stay, she said. She said it carefully, feeling her way. If you want help with the land and the cattle through the summer, I can do that work. The loft is comfortable enough. She paused. I can pay for my keep. I have some money. I would not take your money, he said. Then I will earn my keep in work, she said. The kitchen garden needs someone, and you have enough to do with the cattle and the repairs. He was looking at her in that measuring way again, but the measuring had changed character. It was less about trust and more about something else that she did not want to name too quickly. Susanna, he said, you are 26 years old and a widow, and I am 24 and essentially a temporary occupant in a contested estate. I do not want you to stay out of pity. It is not pity, she said. Then why? She thought about how to answer that honestly and found that honest was the only way she knew how to be. Because I have not felt like I was in the right place in 2 years, she said, and I have been here 5 days and I feel like I am in the right place. The silence between them was the longest one yet, and it had a different quality from the other silences. It was full of something. All right, he said at last. Stay. She went back to town and sent a letter to her boarding house in Abilene to have her trunk forwarded on the next supply wagon, and she told the boarding house she would not be returning. She stood outside the general store after posting the letter, and the cottonwood fluff drifted around her, and the mountains were a deep clear blue, and she thought, this is either the wisest thing I have ever done or the most impractical, and she was not sure she cared which. The weeks that followed were the fullest she had spent in years. The work of the homestead was constant and varied and satisfying in the way that physical work with visible results always was. She took over the kitchen garden entirely, and it responded to the attention, the rows thickening and darkening with the steady green of growing things. She learned the cattle, their individual temperaments and habits, which ones were difficult and which ones could be trusted. She and Clark developed a working rhythm that required very little discussion because they had each figured out what the other was good at, and they defaulted naturally to those strengths. In the evenings they sat on the porch or by the fire and talked in the way that people talked when they were becoming known to each other, sharing the accumulated weight of their individual years, the small stories and the larger ones. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her father's farm and the specific slant of Missouri light in late September, and the smell of the creek at the bottom of the south field. He told her about New Mexico territory, about the Red Rock country and the way the heat came up off the ground in visible waves in August, and about the cattle drives he had worked as a young man and the places they had taken him. He told her about the 6 months in the mine near Pueblo in the winter of 1875, the cold and the darkness of it, and how he had walked out one morning and stood in the sunlight and known without question that he would never go back underground. She told him about Thomas's death, more of it than she had told anyone, the strange loneliness of grief for someone you had loved practically rather than passionately, the guilt that came with feeling less devastated than you thought you ought to be. Clark listened without filling the silences with reassurances she did not need, and that quality, the willingness to simply receive what she said and sit with it, was something she had not encountered often and valued enormously. One morning in late June, she was in the kitchen garden when she heard hoofbeats on the lane and looked up to see 2 riders coming, and one of them was Calvin Aldridge. The other was a man she did not know, younger and wearing the kind of clothes that said he was not a rancher. Clark came out of the barn and stood in the yard. "Walker," Aldridge said, reining up. He did not acknowledge Susanna. "This is Mr. Fenn. He is an attorney from Denver. He has some things to say about this property." The man from Denver dismounted and produced papers from his saddlebag. He spoke with the careful confidence of someone who was paid to be right. He said that he had been retained by Calvin Aldridge to investigate the estate of Randolph Walker, and that based on his investigation, there was no legally valid claim to the property by an undocumented alleged natural son, and that since Mrs. Maddox had not yet formally filed a claim through the territorial court, the property was in a legal limbo that could be resolved through a formal abandonment proceeding which Aldridge was prepared to file immediately. Clark stood very still and listened to all of this with his arms crossed and his jaw set. Susanna pulled off her gardening gloves and walked across the yard. She had sent Harlan Briggs the letter from Randolph along with Clark's written statement 2 weeks ago. Briggs had filed the counterclaim. She said, "Mr. Fenn, this property is currently the subject of a legitimate estate contest filed with the territorial court in Pueblo. I filed it 12 days ago through attorney Harlan Briggs of Dusty Creek. An abandonment proceeding cannot be initiated against a property that is already in active contest." She paused. "You can verify this with the court. The reference number is in the filing." Fenn looked at her with an expression that shifted from condescension to recalculation. "That changes things," he said carefully. "Yes," she said, "it does." Aldridge looked at her and his expression was not pleasant. "You have tied this up on purpose," he said. "On purpose and legally and with complete transparency," she said pleasantly. "Good morning, Mr. Aldridge." They rode away, and when they were gone Clark turned to her and she saw something in his expression that was beyond gratitude now, something that lived in a different country entirely. "You filed the contest," he said. 2 weeks ago," she said. "I should have told you sooner. I wanted to wait until I had confirmation it was properly received. You put your name on a legal filing for me," he said. "Someone had to," she said. "I was the one with the recognized standing." He was looking at her with that new expression, the one that was not measuring or almost smiling but was something she had to look away from because it made her feel too seen. "Susanna," he said. "Do not make it bigger than it is," she said quickly. "It was a legal filing." "It was not nothing," he said. She looked at the mountains. "No," she said. "I suppose it was not nothing." July came in with heat and thunderstorms that rolled over the mountains in the late afternoons, the sky going dark and green in the west, and the thunder rolling down the canyons like something enormous being moved. They would watch the storms from the porch, sitting in the 2 chairs she had found in the barn and carried out, the rain coming in curtains across the meadows, the lightning striking the distant peaks. Clark brought coffee and they sat with the weather, and it was one of the things she began to love about being in this place, this specific kind of being in the world. She had begun to understand that what she felt for Clark Walker was not practical and not careful, and was entirely different from anything she had felt for Thomas or for anyone else. It had built up the way water built up behind a dam, steadily and without announcement, and she was not certain what to do with it. She was a practical woman. She believed in facing things directly, but this felt large enough that facing it directly required a courage she was still assembling. She thought he felt something of the same thing. She had evidence for this in small specific ways. The way he always noticed when she was carrying something heavy and moved to help her without making a performance of it. The way he looked for her in a room when he came into it. The way a conversation between them about something entirely practical would sometimes arrive at a pause that stretched a beat too long, and that neither of them filled because filling it would mean acknowledging what was in it. One evening in late July, the thunderstorm had passed and left the air clear and smelling of rain and sage, and they were sitting on the porch in the blue afterlight, and Clark said, without preamble or apparent cause, "I do not want you to go back to Abilene." She looked at him. "When this is settled," he said, "when the legal situation is settled and you do not have any reason to stay, I do not want you to go." She was very still. "Why not?" she asked, which was perhaps not the most gracious response, but she wanted to hear him say it. He turned to look at her, and the blue evening light was very good on his face, which she noted even as her heart was doing something rapid and disorganized in her chest. "Because you are the best person I have been around in a long time," he said. "Because I think about what it would be like if you were not here, and I cannot make that thought comfortable." He paused. "Because when I set 2 cups out in the morning now, it is because I want to set 2 cups out, not because I heard you moving." She had known it was coming, some version of this, and had thought she was prepared for it, but she was not as prepared as she had believed. She felt the warmth of it move through her like the warmth of good coffee on a cold morning, reaching all the way to places that had been cold for a long time. "Clark," she said, "I know you were not unhappy before," he said, "with Thomas, and I know that practical and not unhappy can feel like enough." He was looking at her very directly. "But I want more than that. For myself, I mean. I want more than practical, and I think you do too." She looked at him for a long moment. The first star was appearing above the eastern mountains, single and very bright. The creek was audible in the evening quiet, murmuring over its stones. Pearl and George were moving gently in the corral. "I am not going back to Abilene," she said. He was quiet. "I am not going back to Abilene," she said again. "And I am not staying because of the legal situation, and I am not staying because I feel sorry for you. I am staying because I want to be here, because this place and you are where I want to be." She paused. "And I think I knew that by the second morning when you set 2 cups out, and I have just been letting myself understand it gradually." He reached across the space between the 2 chairs and took her hand. His hand was warm and rough and certain, and it held hers with the same quiet, deliberate patience that characterized everything he did. She looked at their hands and then at him. "You should have said something," she said. "I was working up to it," he said. She laughed, and he smiled, the full smile, and she leaned across the space between them and kissed him, which was the most practical and also the most absolutely non-practical thing she had ever done, and it tasted like coffee and wood smoke and something entirely new. The summer deepened into August, and the homestead prospered under their combined attention. The kitchen garden was producing abundantly, more tomatoes and squash and beans than the two of them could eat, and Susanna began taking the surplus to the general store in town to sell, which brought in a small income that helped with provisions. She had become recognizable in Dusty Creek as Clark Walker's partner in the homestead dispute, which gave her a status that was somewhere between legally ambiguous and practically established. And the people of the town navigated this with the pragmatic flexibility that small Western communities often showed about situations that did not fit the available categories. The church in town was a small congregation presided over by a minister named Reverend Price, who had come to Colorado Territory from Virginia, and who had brought with him an admirable commitment to making the best of whatever situation he found himself in. He called on them in August and had coffee on the porch and spoke to both of them with an equalness of regard that Susanna appreciated. And when he rode back to town, she and Clark sat for a while without talking, and then Clark said, "What do you want?" She knew what he was asking. "I want this to be mine," she said, "the way it is yours, not on loan and not temporary." He nodded slowly. "I was hoping you would say that." "Are you asking me something?" she said. He turned to look at her. He was serious now, earnest in a way that made her chest ache with something good. "I am not much to offer," he said. "I have a contested claim on 160 acres in Colorado Territory, 30 head of cattle, a roan horse, and a set of work clothes." He paused. "And everything I have is yours if you want it." "That is a great deal more than you think it is," she said. "Susanna Maddox," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation and without qualification, and she meant it in the way that she had not meant the word yes to Thomas, which was not a criticism of Thomas or of her younger self, but simply the fact of what was true now. She meant it with the whole of herself. They were married by Reverend Price on the first Saturday of September 1878, in the small white church in Dusty Creek, with a gathering of the people who had become their community over the summer. The storekeeper and his wife, the blacksmith, the woman who ran the millinery who had taken a liking to Susanna, a few ranching families from the surrounding area who had watched the dispute over the Walker property with interest, and had generally come down on the side of the young man who worked his land honestly, and the woman who had stood in a yard and faced down a Denver lawyer with a legal reference number. Even old Harlan Briggs came, in a suit that had been pressed for the occasion, and shook Clark's hand afterward with a warmth that went beyond professional courtesy. Calvin Aldridge was not there. Susanna wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she bought at the general store, a deep blue that she thought suited the Colorado sky outside the church windows, and she carried a handful of wildflowers that Clark had picked that morning from the meadow without telling her he was going to, which she found when she came down from the loft to find them lying on the table beside her coffee cup. She had cried a little then, not from sadness, but from the unexpectedness of being known well enough that someone would do that particular thing. They rode back to the homestead together in the September afternoon, the aspens on the higher slopes already beginning to turn gold, the air carrying the first suggestion of autumn. Clark reached over and took her hand as they rode and kept it as they followed the lane back to the cabin, and she thought, "This is mine. This sky and this man and this lane and this life. Mine." The autumn was a time of preparation and quiet industry, laying in provisions for the winter, finishing the necessary repairs before the cold came, making the cabin more suited to two people living in it properly rather than one person and a guest. They built a partition that created a small private room from what had been the open sleeping area, and they acquired a proper bed frame from the furniture maker who came through town in October with a wagon load of goods. The kitchen garden came out, and the beds were turned and mulched for the winter. The cattle were managed through the first snows with the efficiency of two people working together who had learned each other's capacities exactly. The legal matter ground on in the way legal matters did. Harlan Briggs sent letters and received letters, and the territorial court in Pueblo processed the estate contest with the pace of an institution that had a great deal to process and no particular urgency about any individual case. In October, a letter arrived from a church in Albuquerque, New Mexico Territory, which Clark had written to in August, and the letter said that they had located a baptism record for one Clark Randolph Walker, born May 12, 1854, son of Randolph Joseph Walker and Elara Walker née Vasquez. Clark held that letter for a long time. Susanna sat across the table from him and watched him hold it. She did not speak because there was nothing to say that the moment did not already contain. When he finally put it down, he looked at her, and his expression was the most open she had ever seen it. "He baptized me with his name," he said. "Randolph, my middle name. I always thought that was just a thing someone had done without much thought." He paused. "He gave me his name." "He knew you were his," she said gently. "I know," Clark said. "I just needed the paper to prove it to the court." He smoothed the letter flat on the table. "And now I have it." Briggs submitted the baptism record to the territorial court in November, along with Randolph's letter acknowledging Clark as his son and the photographic evidence. And by December, the court had ruled that the estate of Randolph Walker could be formally transferred to Clark Walker as the documented natural son and heir of the deceased, with Susanna Walker, née Maddox, listed as co-holder of the property title by right of marriage. When Briggs sent the final paperwork confirming the ruling, Clark read it at the kitchen table and then set it down and looked at Susanna for a long time without saying anything, and she looked back at him. And then he stood up and she stood up, and he held her with the full length of his arms, and she could feel him breathing, slow and deep, like a man who had been holding his breath for a long time and had finally let it go. Calvin Aldridge, it emerged over the winter, had been having his own legal difficulties unrelated to the Walker property. A dispute with a neighboring rancher about water rights had not gone in his favor, and he had retreated from his expansionary ambitions somewhat. He did not trouble them again. The winter in the Colorado Mountain Valley was serious and beautiful, the snow lying deep on the mountains and the meadows white and still, the creek running low and clear under a skin of ice at its edges. They were largely confined to the homestead during the worst weeks of January and February, and far from finding this difficult, Susanna discovered that she and Clark were deeply compatible in the way of people who could be in a small space together for extended periods without exhausting each other. They read in the evenings by the fire, sometimes aloud to each other, which she had always thought sounded like a thing that would be either beautiful or unbearable, and found was entirely beautiful. They played cards, which she was better at than he was, and about which he was a good loser. They talked and cooked and worked the daily maintenance of the homestead in the cold, and came inside to warm up and were, in the simplest possible sense, happy. She told him she was expecting a child in January, standing in the kitchen in the morning before the coffee was done, and his reaction was not complex or measured, but was immediate and entirely uncalculated, a great breaking open of his face into something that was almost too large for the kitchen to contain, and he crossed to her in 2 steps and held her, and she pressed her face into his neck and breathed him in and thought, "Here it is. This is the thing." They sat down eventually and had their coffee and talked about it practically, because they were both practical people, and then Clark looked at her across the table and said, "I want you to know that I know how lucky I am." "You say that," she said, "but you are also quite a lot of work." He laughed. "That is fair. I am lucky too," she said, "in case you did not know that." Spring came to the Walker homestead like a second beginning. The snow came off the mountains and ran down through the meadows in bright, cold streams. The aspen came in silver green on the slopes. The wildflowers appeared in the meadows, the orange ones whose name Susanna had not known her first afternoon here and now knew to be Indian paintbrush, blazing against the green. She planted the kitchen garden with more deliberateness than ever, planting the rows with a winter's worth of consideration behind them. Clark was, in the way of anxious, expectant fathers throughout human history, attentive to the point of mild exasperation and also deeply endearing, and Susanna managed this with a combination of affection and firm reminders that she was a healthy woman of 27 who had ridden 11 days across the plains on horseback and could certainly carry a basket of beans from the garden to the kitchen. The baby arrived on a Thursday in late August 1879, a boy, healthy and loud, and tremendously opinionated about his entry into the world. Clark was in the room, because Susanna had told the midwife from town that he was staying, and the midwife had looked at Clark and looked at Susanna, and decided this was not an argument she was going to win. When it was over and the midwife had gone, and the baby was clean and wrapped, and had exhausted himself into sleep in Susanna's arms, Clark sat on the edge of the bed and looked at this small new person with an expression that was completely unlike any expression Susanna had seen on him before, as though he were encountering something so far beyond the scope of his usual measurements that all his usual tools were useless. "What do you want to name him?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the baby. "Randolph," he said, "if that is all right with you." She looked at her son's small, crumpled, sleeping face. "Randolph Walker," she said, and it sounded right, the weight of it, the continuity. "Yes, that is right." Clark looked at her then, looked away from the baby and at her, and the expression on his face was the most comprehensive thing she had ever seen on a human face, grief and gratitude and love, and something that had no name but was the specific sum of everything they had built together in the past year in this place. "I love you," he said. He had said it before and would say it again, but this time it had the particular force of a thing said in the presence of its own evidence. "I know," she said. "I love you too." She shifted the baby slightly. "Now go make coffee. I have done most of the work today and you could do this part." He laughed and she laughed, and the baby opened his eyes briefly at the sound of it and then went back to sleep with the serene indifference of someone who had more important business to attend to. Harlan Briggs came to visit the following week with a small gift, a silver rattle he said had been his daughter's, and he sat with them on the porch and held Randolph Walker with the careful practice of a grandfather and told them both, with the bluntness of a man too old to bother with indirection, that they had done well for themselves. "I have seen this property go through a great deal in a short time," he said. "I am glad it is settled, and I am glad it is settled on you." "So are we," Susanna said. The years that followed were the kind of years that did not make for dramatic stories, but that were, in the ways that actually mattered, the best kind. Full of work and weather, and the ordinary, extraordinary business of a life lived attentively in a particular place. The homestead grew and improved. They added to the cattle herd carefully, buying sound animals when the finances allowed. They rebuilt the barn properly in 1880, a real structure with proper ventilation, and a hay loft that held enough to see the cattle through even the hardest winter. The kitchen garden became a proper kitchen orchard when Clark planted apple and plum trees along the south fence, which would not produce fruit for several years, but which Susanna approved of on the grounds that someone should be planting for the future. The town of Dusty Creek grew slowly around them, the way small western towns grew in those years, gaining a doctor in 1880 and a school in 1881, which was taught by a young woman from Ohio who was energetic and serious, and who Clark said reminded him of Susanna, which Susanna took as a compliment, and which Clark confirmed was intended as one. Randolph Walker grew from a baby who had opinions into a toddler who had opinions, and a very early capacity for charm, which he deployed with cheerful calculation on anyone who came within range. He had Clark's coloring and something of Susanna's directness, and he spent a great deal of time in the kitchen garden from the time he could walk, following Susanna between the rows and eating tomatoes straight from the vine, with the pleased concentration of a person who has discovered one of life's great pleasures. In 1881, a second child arrived, a girl they named Alara, after Clark's mother, a name that sounded like water over stone, and that she grew into with the same ease with which she grew into everything, a calm and curious child from her first days in the world. Clark came in from the barn one evening in the autumn of 1881, and stood in the kitchen doorway watching Susanna at the stove, Randolph sitting at the table working on the letters of the alphabet on a slate that the schoolteacher had given him, Alara asleep in the small cradle near the fireplace, the smell of the stew she was making filling the room, the fire warm and low. She looked up and saw him standing there and said, "What are you looking at?" "Everything," he said. She understood him. She turned back to the stove and stirred the pot and said, "Come in and close the door. It is cold." He came in and closed the door and helped Randolph with his letters and checked on Alara and put another log on the fire and set the table for dinner, and the evening settled around them like something made specifically for them, like a thing that had always been waiting to be inhabited. There was a night in the winter of 1882, the snow deep outside and the wind going around the cabin in the way of a wind that has some grievance with the world, when they lay awake in the dark long after the children were asleep and the fire had settled to coals, and Clark said into the darkness, "Do you remember the first night you were here? You knocked on the door and I was standing there with a spoon." "Cooking for nobody," she said. "I was," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "I was so angry that someone was coming, I had prepared myself to fight." "I know," she said. "I could see it. And then you walked in and sat down and ate dinner with me like it was the most natural thing," he said. "And I thought, this is the wrong woman for me to want to argue with." He paused. "I did not know what to do with that." "You fed me very well," she said. "That was the right move." He laughed softly. "I had nothing else to offer." She turned onto her side and found his hand in the dark the way she always did, the way it was always where she expected it to be. "You had everything to offer," she said. "You just did not know it yet." He held her hand in the darkness, and the wind went around the cabin and the children slept, and the fire held its warmth against the cold outside, and the mountains stood in the dark, permanent and immense, holding the valley in their arms the way they had always held it and would go on holding it long after any of them were gone. "I want to tell you something," Clark said. "Tell me," she said. "I am glad you came," he said, "for the belongings or whatever the reason was." I am glad you came, and I am glad you stayed, and I am glad every single morning when I wake up and you are here." He paused. I wanted to say it plainly. "I am glad too," she said, "every morning." She pressed her face briefly against his shoulder. "Every storm and every spring and every summer, every day I have been here. Even the days with Aldridge. Even those," she said, "those were good days. We were good on those days." He moved closer to her in the dark. "We have been good on all the days," he said. "We have," she agreed. Outside, the snow was coming in waves across the mountain valley, laying itself over the meadows and the frozen creek and the pastures where the cattle stood with their patient bovine endurance of the winter. And the cabin stood against it all the way a good thing stood, steadily and without ceremony, the smoke rising from its chimney into the cold, dark sky. The kitchen garden would come in the spring. The apple trees were closer now to bearing fruit. The children would grow up under the wide Colorado sky that Susanna had thought, on her first afternoon riding into this valley, that a person could do worse than to end up beneath. Clark would be in the barn at dawn, and at the table for coffee, and out in the fields, and on the porch in the evenings watching the weather come over the mountains. And she would be in the garden and in the kitchen, and in the saddle and beside him on the porch and in the dark with her hand in his. And this was what she had not known she was riding toward on that Tuesday when the letter arrived, and she decided that grief was a country she had lived in long enough. She had come to collect a dead man's belongings, and she had found something so far beyond that particular errand that the errand itself had become almost irrelevant, almost funny, a small practical thing that had opened a door she had not known was there. She had found a man standing in a kitchen cooking for nobody, and she had knocked on the door and been let in, and she had never left, and she did not intend to. In the spring of 1883, the apple trees bloomed for the first time, white and extravagant against the blue sky, and Clark lifted Randolph up to see the blossoms, and Susanna stood in the kitchen garden holding Alara against her hip, and watched them, and thought about all the things that a person planted without knowing how they would turn out. How much faith the act of planting actually required, and how sometimes, if you were very fortunate, the thing you planted grew into something even better than you had imagined when you put the seed in the ground. The mountains held the valley. The creek ran over its stones. The cottonwood sent up its white fluff in the late May air like the lightest snow, the way it had on her first afternoon here, drifting through the sunlight like something between a beginning and a blessing. She had come to collect a dead man's belongings. She had stayed for the living.